Balcones' first ever year-round bourbon was an inspiration. It all had to work together. A blend of carefully selected ingredients, Texas-sized pot stills, and creative people determined to find the absolute best way to usher a new whiskey along. When you discover how it pairs with a meaningful moment, suddenly the feeling of drinking great whiskey becomes a whole lot more.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Whiskey Neat, spirited conversations with interesting people. I am your host, Kristopher Hart. This week, I'm extremely lucky to have this episode. So today we are joined by John Glaser. John Glaser is a powerhouse in blended whiskey and Scotch. I am so excited and so honored to actually sit down with this guy, this man. He is not a peer in any regard. I mean, he deserves to be put on a pedestal. So this man, and it may be exaggeratory, and it may be a little bit of my ignorance, but exaggeratory is not a word. It may be exaggeration or hyperbole, but I will say that I think that he is greatly, if not solely, responsible for changing the opinions of blended whiskey. For years, people thought single malt was superior. Single malt just means it comes from one distillery. And the rules for Scotch are applied to the name Scotch, not just single malt. So it applies to blends. The standards are there. And he has been blending some of the most fantastic whiskey today, made today in Scotland. So Compassbox, they're here today. We're rejoined by Kerrin. I absolutely love and adore Kerrin. She's I think now they've got more than, she used to just be, I think, the only national brand rep for Compassbox here in the U.S. And now I think there are several, but she's a beast to be reckoned with. She is amazing. Very excited about today's show. Let's get through the ads, and while I pour myself a drink, I am excited to try this too. So Amrut sent me, I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm going to say Amrut Cadhambam, Cadhambam, Amrut, anytime they come to these, so the sherry we did last time came in a box like this. It's obviously a big bump in proof. This is 100 proof. I'm super excited to try this. And so let's start from the top. This week's episode is, as always, sponsored by Terlato Distell Artisan Spirits, leader in premium artisan products like Bunnahabhain, Deanston, Ledaig, Tobermory, Bains, Black Bottle, and of course, Scottish leader. Of course, we love our friends over at Balcones. They're here as well. And for those who are based in Houston, who are excited about the upcoming HBS releases of a peated single barrel of Balcones and the Smoky Mary, the larger barrel, Southern Glazers is still looking for those barrels. They got kind of lost in the system. They're building a brand new warehouse in Katy. And during this transition, it's showing in the system, but nobody can get their physical hands on certain things. So it's coming. I get a few PMs a day about it. All right, Whiskey Neat is supported by the inspired spirits at Glaser of Imports and Amrut Distilleries. We love featuring Amrut whiskeys on the show. Amrut crafts single malt whiskey to the exacting standards of Scotch. And if you need proof, well, at this year's Proof Awards, Amrut Fusion received double gold, 96 points, in blind tastings by 30 industry judges. I had Amrut on last week. I love the Fusion. If you are a peat head, it is single-handedly one of my favorite things that they make. Amrut does two things really, really well. They do really great wine finishes, and they do really, really great peated whiskey. They do a lot of things well, but those two things always speak to like the nerd in me. I love the sherry bombs. I love the peated bombs. Amrut appreciates that the great state of Texas has become the number one consumer of this elixir of life, which is what the word Amrut means in America, in freedom. So without further ado, Kerrin Egalka and John Glaser from Compassbox. Cheers. Kerrin, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm going to try to smile more this time.
Okay. John, very nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you, Chris.
I'm very honored, a bit giddy, trying not to be starstruck here. We've got a recent curse on the show that's been given to us, so I hope your health is in good standing. We've had 2 guests pass within 2 weeks of doing the show, and one of them was John Witherspoon from I don't know if you remember the actor John Witherspoon. He just passed, the comedian from Friday. And
oh yeah,
so there's been a little bit of some joking online as to whether or not. So I hope you're doing good.
I'm feeling great. Yeah,
you look great. You look like you work out a little bit.
No problem there.
So all right, well, let's jump into this. I'm excited. What do we have in front of me?
Well, we have our latest limited edition release called Myths and Legends.
Okay.
Yeah. And we've never done a release, a range release like this as a limited edition. And this is something that's been in my head for several years. And what we've got here, 2 of these 3 are single malt whiskeys.
Oh, okay.
We being Compassbox being known as a blender.
A blend, yeah. And again, in the intro, I give you full credit. I think what Compassbox has done to help change, I would say there's a lot of, I say this not as an insult, but there is a lot of ignorance in the sense that of not knowing any better with some average consumers on what words mean. They think that this is better or that's better. Yeah. And you have single-handed, I say single-handedly, there may be some other ones out there, but we don't care about them, that have changed the perception. I mean, some of the best whiskey I've ever had. I love the Spaniard. My wife and we have a couple of bedside bottles that we like when we're watching our shows together, you know? So we will put like a bottle next on our bedside table. And when we're watching, the latest season of American Horror Story or some show that me and my wife are watching together, the Spaniard. I think we've gone through 3 bottles in the last 6 months or so.
Depletions.
Wow, yeah,
that's good. Yeah. So I give a lot of credit to you guys. I think that you guys have changed. Circus was the first thing that just kind of knocked me off my feet. And Peat Monster. I'm such a lover of Peat Monster, so
right.
Very big fan.
Good. Well, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, blending is what we use blending as a platform for creativity. That's what we are all about. Compassbox is a creative business, but we've never done single malt whiskeys because malt whiskeys from one single place. We tend to make our whiskeys by sourcing whiskeys from different distilleries and put them together and blend them and create something that's proprietary, that's ours, right? That no single distillery can make. But in this case, what we wanted to do is challenge some of the myths around Scotch whiskey, or you might say, flip that around and say, enlighten people around some of the truths in Scotch whiskey.
My perception. I didn't realize that those 2 were going to be together, believe it or not. So, yes.
And we're trying to do that with this range. So yeah, this is a geeky range, for people who are kind of like to geek out a little bit on whiskeys and Scotch whiskey in particular. So 2 single malts here, because what we're showing with them is that something most people don't realize is even your favorite single malt bottling, okay, from your favorite distillery that you can buy year in year out, go to your favorite wine spirit store and buy, will be the product of blending. There will be a blender behind, someone responsible for blending different casks from that same distillery, that single malt distillery, to create a consistent batch
profile.
Yeah, profile, batch to batch, exactly. So people don't realize that. So many single malt bottlings will be blends of casks that might be different types of casks. Could be American oak cask, could be a sherry cask, could be slightly different ages. Okay. And there'll be a recipe that distillery uses to create a consistent profile. They don't realize that. So what we're doing is the exact same thing, but instead of choosing our casks from under one distillery roof, we're choosing casks from a variety of different distilleries, usually 3 or 4 or something like that. Yeah.
So the single malts, now you guys have always been huge on transparency, and you guys have even, now you're taking the approach of kind of dispelling some misunderstandings around certain things. You guys have also capitalized on, Compassbox has specifically found holes in which there have been times where you try to be super transparent, and the Scotch Whisky Association is like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And the famous story of the 3-year-old, right, is one of my, someone was recently posting about it in HBS. It's such a fantastic pour, and it's advertised as being 3 years old, but I think it's like 0.01% of the blend or something, some crazy
just
low
under
number.
1%. Yeah, is actually 3 years old, and everything else is
significantly older,
considerably older. I'll just, since you asked, over 20 years old. So
wow. So what's the story on these 2 specific single malts? Are you?
Yeah.
Is that out there? Do we know what's?
Yeah, it's all out there. Yeah, the information that is, and it's even on the back of the label. You've got the recipe breakdown.
Should we start with this one?
Yeah, we'll start because they do kind of build up. The 3, they are a range, and they kind of build up one to another. So we'll start with Myths and Legends 1. Thank you, Kerrin. What we're doing here is showing people that. That single malts are blends as well, in a sense, blends of different casks from one single distillery. What we've done here is we've taken several different parcels of casks from one distillery.
That smells fantastic.
Okay, so different parcels, some are different, and each of those parcels represent different cask types. And what is important to know is that the cask in whiskey is the flavor driver. Yes, the distillery spirit has inherent flavor and a distinctiveness, but it's the cask that's driving somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 or 70% of the flavor, right? So we've got different parcels from the same distillery, from different cask types and different ages. And when we were working on these, James and Jill were leading on these, on putting things together, the recipes together. We were trying to create balance and layers of complexity from different parcels of casks from one distillery. So therefore, it's a single malt, but it still took several months of blending work for us.
And different ages. Yeah, so I saw it's all from Ball Blair.
This is all from the Ball Blair Distillery.
And
correct.
It's this. Even in bourbon, we get constantly this misunderstanding around. I've seen people refer to bourbons as a blended bourbon. I'm like, no, that's not blended bourbon. Just because Booker's is a batch of 300 barrels doesn't mean it's not. There's this constant battle with trying to get people to understand terminology and definitions and dispel any kind of misunderstanding around what is just, look, it's delicious drinking.
And that's the thing. If I just kind of skip to the end, so to speak, it's really not about categories. It's not about categories. Categories can throw you off. People think, it's got the word blend in the category. Blended Scotch. I don't drink blended anything. Well, if that's the way people think, you're missing out on a whole world of enjoyment, because there are people who make whiskeys that have blend in that category name, like I would argue the third one we're about to get to, that are as compelling as some of the greatest single malts made in Scotland, without a doubt.
100% agree. I mean, that's why I think you guys have done that. If it hadn't been for you guys, I think what it is, and this may be dumbing it down or being a little too simplistic, but I think traditionally speaking, when people think of blends, they may think of some other brands that have been around, a picture of a man walking on the front label and so forth, that I think that people tend to write off the exceptional presentation of, like, you guys were the first to be like, hey, no, look, check this out. Not only do you guys have the best labels on the planet, the best artwork I've ever seen ever.
These are really good whiskeys to talk about the artwork too.
But they're also fantastically delicious. I mean, I'm getting a ton of, we had Bushmills on yesterday. In their standard.
You just live this life every day.
It's fantastic, yeah.
It's your job.
I was getting pear off their standard Bushmills, and I get a ton of pear from this, a ton of really... there's a distillery in Louisville called Copper and Kings. Joe Herron, love Joe. I'm going to see him in a couple of weeks. But they make a pear brandy, and it tastes like really sharp, ripe pears. And I get a little bit on the nose here. There's a ton of pear.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And when these are out now, you can get them nationwide.
Indeed, yeah.
Very small allocation, but small production. But yeah, readily available right now. I've seen them on shelves here in the great state of Texas already.
Tons of information on the back of this. Natural color, non-chill filtration, no chill filtration.
Yeah, most people a lot of people don't realize that most Scotch whiskies, even most single malts, are colored to look darker.
Sure.
They're colored with spirit caramel. And that's something we've never done, because whiskey's a natural product. Just take a grain and some water and yeast and ferment and distill and throw it in some oak, and that's whiskey. So why would you muck it up with
because of the
spirit caramel?
consumer, right? There's this thing, there's this
Yeah.
vice. Unfortunately, a lot of people, whiskey, not just whiskey, rum makers, they feel like their hands are twisted when they cut with water, bottle down. They feel the need, like, oh, well, if we don't do this, it's going to hurt us. And I think that we live in a beautiful era of this hobby, of this entire spirits hobby, that people are caring less and less about what you think you're supposed to do.
Right.
Right. And I had a conversation with Richard Seal from Foursquare, and he's big about no adulteration. I'm like, well, coloring, depending on the category, is considered an adulterant, right? And because they cut down, he's like, well, we only colored to the point of what it looked like before we cut it with water.
Right.
Okay.
Let's
try it without.
Yeah.
Because you make some of the best rum that's ever been produced ever is coming out of Foursquare Distilleries. So,
and that's it. The producers, certainly in Scotland, think that, well, consumers expect this, so we have to do it. Well, they'll always expect it if you always do it.
Correct, yeah.
And, many producers will tell you it doesn't affect flavor, but we can prove that it does affect flavor, particularly in some of the quantities that some producers use. So we're just being purists about it. So we do not color.
Ever add color.
Ever.
And even you guys, when you taste through different parcels, you guys will taste in dark glasses and everything, so that you guys aren't influenced by color at all.
Yeah, we are easily biased when we taste whiskeys or wines or anything by things like color and the name associated with it. So when we do taste in the office, particularly when we're doing tastings of our whiskeys with other whiskeys out there, competitor whiskeys, always in dark glasses, black or blue glasses, so you can't see the color, because it's all likely that most other whiskeys will be colored, and that will affect your judgment.
Which is how I think some distilleries, like on Isla, they use green glass to kind of remove the perceived notion of you seeing two whiskeys sitting on the shelf and one's darker, so this must be better.
Yeah, absolutely. The best way to taste whiskey, and wine for that matter, being a wine person too, is blind. Totally blind. Yeah. There's a woman named Maggie Harrison at Antica Terra in Oregon. She's a Pinot Noir producer, and she's an extraordinary Pinot Noir producer. And one of the things, I was listening to an interview with her recently, is she tastes all the barrel samples blind. Doesn't want to know, well, I guess we're talking about Pinot Noir, but even with a winemaker and you talk about one grape, you'll know this block from the vineyard is one of my best blocks. So I'm going to expect that one to be really, really good.
Sure.
This one down below, maybe not so much. And those are biases that even a winemaker will have of his or her own vineyard, right? Take all that bias out, taste totally blind, and just go on a completely unbiased sense of what you've got in the glass. And that's how she constructs her blends, without regard for where those parcels come from within a vineyard or whatever.
We had on Al Young from Four Roses, and they mentioned that being there every day, sampling through product with consumers, he said, we notice a trend as to which part of the warehouse is most preferred.
Right, yeah.
And are you active on Facebook at all? Are you aware of the markets out there, the black markets, so to speak?
We are as a business, yes.
Sure.
Not myself, perhaps, individually.
Well, there's this crazy shenanigans that happened recently in which people were essentially paying more for specific single barrels of Four Roses, a lot more, specifically because of where it was in the warehouse.
Right.
Without any regard to the fact that each barrel is different.
Right.
And even if you did get like 3 or 4 great barrels in this one area, you're talking about a warehouse with 20,000 barrels.
Right, yeah.
So it's crazy to me, and at least it's an experiment in human psychology to see the correlations that people draw and the biases they develop, even when they're not intending to.
Yeah.
So I fully support the whole,
So next whiskey tasting, do everything blind. Don't tell people what it is. Whiskey clubs, whatever, people get together and there's like a dozen whiskeys or whatever. Do everything blind and try to find glasses or some way of letting everyone taste without seeing color. And people will be surprised, but also about things that they won't expect to happen. Or I didn't expect to like that, or it's like this. But it's also really educational. Take the bias out. Now you're having to think about exactly what your impression is, bias free.
We should we should blindfold everyone at the Whiskey Social next
Yeah,
year.
that's
All
something.
1,500
No,
people in one. Yeah,
But that's kind of a
Have them
cool
walk around in the
idea.
dark.
Eyes wide shut. Feel some strange.
That's kind of a cool idea. Or maybe it's a smaller tasting on the
Sure.
side or something like that.
Rachna, remember the woman who does whiskey stories in New York? You met her. She made a Peat Monster
Yeah,
perfume. She does these whiskey in the dark tastings where she blindfolds everyone and
Yeah,
it's all
that's right.
sensory.
Yeah.
And they're
How many
super
people?
successful. It's like 15 to 20.
I'd like to
Okay,
do
yeah.
the next
yeah,
tasting.
not 1,500. Right?
Sure.
Next time
Yeah.
we do like a tasting, like a 50 people at a whiskey fest or something like that, one of those events, I'd like to do them blind.
If they were seated,
Yeah.
and you had them pre-poured,
Yeah, absolutely.
I bet that could work. Like as soon
No,
as
no.
they check in, they're blindfolded and they're escorted to the chair.
Seated, pre-poured, glasses numbered,
Yeah.
so avoid confusion.
Sure.
And also avoid knocking things
Liabilities
over,
and-
liability.
Shenanigans.
Everyone
Shenanigans.
use
I think,
your
like,
use your hands on the table to find your glass. A truly blind tasting would be fun. It'd be a little. You'd have to figure out the logistics and make sure no one knocked anything over. But I think I don't know of anyone else doing it, so it'd be fun. What's next? What do we? Oh wait, let's talk about the artwork real quick before we move on. So while you're pouring, I'll say that.
I'll do that.
So what's going on with the artwork?
So we'll do that one next.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, the artwork, it's sort of this impressionistic approach that we do frequently. But I don't want to, it's like asking a songwriter or a band to questions about explaining their lyrics, right?
Sure. Well, she just mentioned that these would be great to talk about the artwork, so I figured I'd mention what you can say about it.
But what you'll see with the labels is there's a progression in the whiskey itself as we taste it. You'll see, and the label
nose
artwork
on
reflects that. The label artwork reflects that progression in the whiskey. So you'll see, the first label is more daylight, sort of early day kind of daylight. The second one that we're getting to now is more sort of later in the evening
Dusk.
evening light. Yeah. And then when we get to the last one, well, you know where that's going.
Nighttime.
So the second one, this is also a single malt. And the idea we're playing with here, or addressing here, the thing we're enlightening people about, or the myth that we're challenging, however you want to look at it, is that there's this idea of regionality in Scotch whiskey.
Terroir.
This terroir idea, this wine-like idea that certain styles of whiskey are made in certain regions, that the region and something about the climate or the area, the terroir, to use that wine word, it has an effect on the flavor of the whiskey. And it's not like wine at all. You can make any style of Scotch whiskey anywhere in Scotland. And it's because it's all about decisions that the maker will make around barley, type of barley, smoked, not smoked, how smoked, fermentation, what kind of yeast, how long you ferment, distillation, how you manage your distillation, really hot and fast or slow, where you make your cuts and the spirit. And then, of course, importantly, the cask type, right? Those are all decisions that individuals make, right? And none of those have to do with the local geography,
Yeah.
right? So
you're not a believer of terroir in general.
I am in wine.
So can I ask a clarification? Okay, let me push on that because
Yeah.
so Mike Raymond, Mike Reserve 101. I had this conversation with him off camera, and it was the first time I had heard someone really dispel this idea of terroir in whiskey. And the two examples I can think of, first off, is peat. Right, so Islay has I would say, a correlation between its distilleries in which the peat is of a certain note or similarity, and there is some peat from the mainland that I would say, like I get a peated whiskey from Balvenie.
Yeah.
It's not quite the same smokiness that I see quite frequently in Islay.
Yeah. So there is something there around the aroma flavor profile that peat will give to barley when you're using it to smoke and dry your barley. Because as you point out, peat from Islay will be compressed earth from vegetation found in that part of Scotland.
Sure.
If you're digging peat and sourcing peat from the northern part of Scotland, it'll be a different vegetative profile.
Sure.
So there is something there in the smoke profile might be different, but what we don't have in Scotland is people saying, well, I'm only telling people where the peat is being sourced from, and identifying that on the labels. And people will be buying, or the peated barley I'm talking about, in terms of identifying where they're sourcing it from. So we don't have people disclosing that, and people can be buying peated barley from anywhere in Scotland and shipping it to any distillery anywhere.
I see.
So I guess it's sort of like saying you're making wine from grapes sourced in another country and you're making it here. Well, that grape might have a distinctiveness from that area, but now you're making it here, and maybe you're blending it with something else, and
it's hard
really
to
a terroir idea.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
So with peat, there's an argument, I guess, for it. But if we're talking, most distilleries make unpeated whiskey in Scotland, and now you've lost that. There's no peat aspect at all.
Yeah, I can't.
So there's
think of
nothing else from the geography or the climate, with the exception of climate and how it affects maturation over time. So there could be something in that, if it's hot and dry or if it's
temperature,
cold and damp.
That was my other example. Texas. Texas, we've been trying for 12, 13 years now to kind of recreate Kentucky bourbon to no avail, right? So we attribute it to climate. It's very, very hot.
There'll be a climate effect on maturation and how that works. But what the myth is that people, you can even read it in some whiskey books, is in Speyside, the whiskeys have a heathery, flowery, fruity character.
Sure.
And on Islay, they're all peaty. Well, most of them are peaty on Islay because that's a local tradition, but not all of them necessarily.
Yeah,
Look at
Bunnahabhain and Bruichladdich,
yeah. Lowland whiskies are all light and delicate, right? Well, if you ever tasted Glenkinchie spirit off the still compared to, other single malts, you'll see it's actually quite a big spirit. So those kinds of things are the myth of regionality, that the Highlands taste like this, Lowlands taste like this, Islands always taste like this. That's what we're addressing.
And I agree. There's always, I think everyone, if you really just picked out a few examples in each region, there's not a real consistent. I mean, Speyside gets credit for all the really deep. A lot of my favorite sherried whiskeys come from Speyside, right?
Yeah, but that's not anything unique to. It's not because people make sherry in Speyside,
of course,
or whatever.
Right? Yeah. No.
I mean, do with the region or the geography or the climate.
Glenmorangie and Dalmore are not in Speyside, and they're really big on sherry.
So it's really about the decisions that makers make in the process. So what we've got here is a Speyside whiskey in Myths and Legends number 2. And so people think, oh, and the other thing is, like, how many people have ever smelled heather? What does heather smell like? Not much, actually, is the answer. Not much.
Don't tell my wife.
But
who's Heather?
Where was I?
Sorry.
The off-color jokes had to come in at some point.
So yeah. And so this is, people think Speyside whiskeys are, heathery and fruity, but what you've got here is almost tropical fruit in this Speyside whiskey, which to somebody who subscribes to the belief that regions all have a distinct aroma and flavor, it explodes that, because you've got this tropical fruit character going on, which is really from the spirit of this distillery, this is malt whiskey from the Glenelgin distillery, combining with the cask types, these American oak and Richard American oak casks, and age, because the whiskeys in here, are between. They start at 14, but they go up much higher. If you ask me the
spectrum, I have to ask. Okay,
yeah.
How old is the stuff in here?
Yeah, and then they go up to 23 years old.
Okay,
so, yeah.
So,
we can break it all down
you
for you,
start from
parcel by
the
parcel.
minimum age in the conversation, and
yes.
then
If you ask me, I can
beautiful.
tell you. Yes, yeah. So there you go. So 2 single malts from Compassbox, a blending house. Well, why would we do that? Because we were blending parcels from one distillery. The same exercise we go through to make any of our whiskeys. They just, in this case, all the whiskeys we've used come from one distillery.
Let's talk about something I see on the label here that'd be interesting to those who don't know. You mention refill bourbon hogsheads and American oak hogsheads. Try saying that 3 times fast after drinking whiskey. Hogsheads.
Yes.
Where? I mean, you may not be able to. You may not even know what distillery makes American hogsheads, but what distillery makes American hogsheads?
What distillery or what cooperage?
Sure.
Why don't we start with what is a hogshead?
Sure.
Yeah. So most of the casks aging whiskey in Scotland today, and in the neighborhood of 3/4 or give or take, I don't know if anyone knows the exact percentage, are derived from former American whiskey barrels. And mostly American, maybe some Canadian, but that's where most of the casks in Scotland start from. And some of them are shipped over as barrels, 200-liter barrels, and reused. Some of them are broken down. The staves the barrels broken down into staves, and they're sent to Scotland and then rebuilt. Some as barrels, but most of them are, when they're rebuilt in Scotland, will be rebuilt as hogsheads. So they'll make a 250-liter cask in this case.
60 gallons.
60 gallons. I'm a metric now. So.
Oh, sorry.
But 60 gallons.
In freedom, it's about 60 gallons. in America. Let's see. I think a normal bourbon barrel is 220 liters, right?
200 liters.
200 liters.
195, 200,
Yeah, so that's about 60 gallons, right? 60,
right, yeah, 60-gallon barrels. But the hogshead is 250 liters, so, add 25% to 60, and there you go.
Okay.
And and they're rebuilt. So bigger heads will be put on them, and they're fatter and wider than the barrels. So most casks in Scotland aging whiskey are hogsheads. Hogsheads.
Interesting.
Yes, that's what hogshead is.
Well,
we identify. Yeah, sorry.
No, I apologize. Go ahead.
I was simply going to say we identify hogsheads as first fill, meaning the first time they've ever been used in Scotland. After they've been rebuilt.
Sure.
Refill would be could be second, could be third, could be even fourth refill. And sometimes we'll get recharred hogsheads. So hogsheads have been used once or twice in Scotland, and then gone back to the cooperage, scrape down the wood inside to get to sort of fresh oak, if you will, rechar it, and you get a different kind of maturation, a more oaky maturation with a recharred hogshead. So there you go. There's the geeky detail on hogsheads.
Yeah, it's awesome.
There are also sherry hogsheads, which just to make your head explode a little bit, which is, yeah.
So it's sherry butt that's been disassembled and turned into a hogshead.
A cask built as a hogshead, but filled with sherry. And so even in Spain, some places will fill sherry into hogsheads. Yeah.
Delicious. I'm a big sherry fan. Speaking of sherry, shout out to Will Schragus. I haven't talked to him yet, but we did a Dalmore dinner the other night, and they brought in some. We got to try some dirty old sherry next to their 18-year-old, which is uses the same sherry barrels once they're transitioned. And every time I drink sherry now, I think of Will. So
Will's my friend that runs Barrel Bourbon.
Right.
Whenever he calls, it says "Fancy Boy" on my phone. So everyone that's in the car with me.
You don't want to know what it says on my phone when he calls.
I kind of do.
It says Will. I'm just being funny.
Oh, okay.
So this is a bit more. I want to say robust, but not as an insult to the first. But this is a bit more heavy, a bit more mouthfeel, a bit more. Definitely can pick up more on the sherry notes. It only says 3% refill sherry butts.
Refill, yeah, a small percentage.
But feels
you're getting
more
unctuousness on the palate.
There it is.
Right, there's a big word for you.
You should make whiskey.
Yeah.
So do you guys have plans to do that at all? I mean, I know that you guys blend, but are you guys distilling at all?
Oh, that's not what I meant. I meant make. I meant like you should be a whiskey maker.
Sure,
I was just making a joke.
Well, it triggered the question in my head, like, oh, you guys,
we no, not at the moment. We looked at it like over 10 years ago. We looked at building or buying a distillery, and it's just we decided it's not what we're about. It would have been a different business than what we do, which is creating whiskeys from different distilleries. And so we decided. I like being a blender.
Sure.
Right? And so I don't have an interest in distilling now because we're fortunate, in a really fortunate position to have access to so many different distilleries. Over 100 distillers in Scotland. We don't have access to all of them, of course, but we have access to so much.
You've been messing around with new make, especially with when we did Stranger and Stranger. We have a little bit. But it's more for the wood purposes.
Yeah, we fill. The way we operate is we buy, and historically bought in the early days, bought everything, all the whiskeys fully matured, and then we combine them the way we want to combine them for our recipes, and then marry them after they're blended and bottle them. But over the last 7-8 years now, we've been also filling new make whiskey every year at a variety of different distilleries. So we source the casks from various places, from Spain, from France, from the U.S., and we send them to the distilleries and have them filled for us and lay them down for the future.
Nice.
So that's as close to distilling as we're getting now.
Sure.
We're also, we are talking with one distillery about creating custom spirit for us, and that's something that, we may be doing down the line.
You either tell us a distillery or you have to drink the Malort.
What's wrong with Malort?
So I had it for the first time.
From Chicago, right?
When we were testing that out. Isn't that bar that you guys work with a lot? Delilah's up there.
Yeah.
Sure is.
Oh, yes, indeed.
You guys are
Sean's
pretty
old
close to
friend
them.
Mike
I'm not sure it's a big Malort bar, but yeah.
Let me ask you a question about your process. So in bourbon, we see quite often a lot of master distillers will mention that when they are tasting and blending, they cut down to 60 proof or lower.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do that? Or
Yeah.
when you're blending, do you like to cut it down to well below Scotch standards of 80 proof?
When we're assessing casks, particularly 20% alcohol is a strength that we will frequently taste at. So most whiskeys are bottled at 40% or 43 or 46, or
Sure.
cask strength in Scotland can be anything, 50s or whatever. But when we are assessing casks of the same sort, and we want to understand if there are any sort of inconsistencies or any differences, we will go down to 20%. At 20%, two things. One is any flaws or differences are going to be much more apparent. And also at 20%, it allows you to taste several things in a row without getting palate fatigue. So 20% is a common tasting strength in Scotland for those kinds of situations.
Is there any concern when you ramp up? So if it tastes great at 20%,
Yeah.
and you're like, we want to release it at cask strength at 55 or whatever,
Yeah.
is there any concern that it won't translate back?
Yes, there would be, but we taste at 20 just to be able to taste a bunch of things that are really similar and be able to tease out the slight differences. When we're tasting to assess a recipe, like do we want to bottle this, or tasting to decide what strength we want to bottle something at, yeah, obviously we're going to taste it at, like for example, when we were doing these are all bottled at 46. We were evaluating all the recipes throughout the months of work on this at 46%. So we would assess the recipes at the strength that the drinker is going to experience them at. Yeah. So 20% is just a technical exercise to try to weed out things that are really quite similar. Also, if we have like a batch of a new batch of whiskey that we bottle every year, say Peat Monster, for example, we have benchmarks that we're trying to hit. So benchmark bottlings, and we're trying to make the new vatting or the recipe, the new blend, as close as we can to the benchmark. And those times that's also a time when we'll assess at 20%. We'll take the benchmark down to 20%, and the vattings we're doing down to 20% to see if they're similar. That's really geeky detail. Yeah?
It's something I think people
sure you
care
want to
about.
Keep that on air? Yeah?
I do, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm curious if something tastes amazing, and there's no major flaw at 20%. But you decide you want to bottle it, see what it tastes like at 50 and it be off-putting? Has it ever, because I constantly hear about going this way to find flaws, but I never hear anyone talk about when we go back up, we don't want it here at 60 because it's that flaw really comes out, but we like it here because it still works. You know what I mean?
Well, if there's a flaw, first of all, in a cask, so an off note or something unexpected from this distillery, we wouldn't use those casks. So it's not. So when we're assessing for bottling strength to decide, we'll try to various different strengths. And the story of the Spaniard's a good example. We bottled that at 43%. We had assumed throughout the process of making that last year that we would bottle it at 46%, like we do most of our malts. But we found when we got to the end and we had the recipe pretty much nailed, that it just was so much more expressive and so much more sexy, really, at 43% than it was at 46%. So we decided, we're going to do it at 43%. And, there's a little risk that the malt whiskeys, when you don't chill filter, as we don't, when you bottle them under 46%, there's a little risk it could go a little hazy when it gets cold. But
who cares?
Who cares? Exactly. That shows you, if your malt whiskey goes slightly hazy in the glass when it gets cold or you add a little water, that's a good sign.
Sure.
It shows you that the whiskey was not chill filtered. Chill filtering is really a cosmetic step that removes
where people feel obligated to do it. That's the problem.
It's the way it's always been done, right? For a long time.
Level of ignorance, yeah.
But when you chill filter, you do take out oils in the malt whiskey that are responsible for the hazing. But in removing those oils, you're removing mouthfeel, and you're removing viscosity, and you're removing flavors associated with those oils. And again, people will say, "Oh, it doesn't really make a difference to flavor," but we believe it confidently it does.
Sure.
Especially hedonism in the freezer, we were saying the other day, when you take it out of like something like that out of the viscosity that you get, like that wouldn't be the same if.
Yeah, mouthfeel in whiskey is overlooked when people talk about whiskey and assess whiskey, I believe. And a lot of people who knows whiskey, a lot of master blenders, which is a marketing word, and that's another story. But not a lot of blenders in Scotland and people who make whiskeys in Scotland. Very often they'll just nose and never taste, or not always taste. And I think it's fundamentally important to taste, to understand how things feel in the mouth. They could smell amazing, but I think you have to taste as well. Yeah.
There's it's crazy to me because the opposite is true for vodka. They'll add glycol. They'll add mouthfeel, and it's so crazy to me that depending on what the spirit is and how it's drank or how it's used, that you've got these common practices that people feel that they have to do it this way. I have to filter it out. I mean, when my wife makes soup, I know this is a dumb comparison, but when my wife makes soup and it's fresh and it's hot, you don't see anything. But the moment she throws it in the fridge and I take it for leftovers the next day, you'll see clumps of fat and grease that have solidified. And if we... I don't think that there's a way to chill filter soup, but if you removed all of that, that's all flavor and mouthfeel. Yeah. It's the same thing. It's fats that have solidified.
It's a good analogy.
It just feels so unclassy with sitting with John Glaser talking about whiskey and I'm talking about Mexican soup and.
I do think that challenging things is important, whether we're talking about whiskey or even your wife's soup. What if you did this differently, honey? Kind of stuff.
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that.
I don't recommend that.
What do you mean dinner's not ready? I'm just kidding.
I believe that we as whiskey makers, as a business, as Compassbox, we have an obligation
to push the envelope.
Yeah, to challenge things when you're in the interests of making things better. And so we've always challenged in those cases things like chill filtering and adding color. We never bothered with it and don't see the reason for doing it. But things like we were talking about age statements before, and you're legally you can only talk about the age of the youngest component in a blend. It's illegal to talk about anything else because
it's silly.
Trying to protect consumers against unscrupulous marketers who might say, "Oh, there's a little bit of 60-year-old whiskey in here, but there's hardly any," kind of stuff. But I think challenge is important. With positive intent. I mean, over the years, people will come up and say, "Oh, you guys, I love it because you're rebels." I draw a distinction between being a rebel, right, and being a heretic. Yeah.
What a word.
I'm proud.
What a word.
To be a heretic with positive intent. Not all the heretics in history were bad people.
Bottling?
Heresy.
Yeah, heresy.
Heresy is
first.
But it's heresy or being a heretic, but with positive intent.
Sure.
Really, challenging dogma, right? Challenging the way things have always been done.
Challenging dogma is exactly what I think all spirit makers should do. There's this concept that I met a gentleman at a dinner last week. He's Native American. He's a food writer. And I asked him about cultural appropriation in food, and specifically in spirits, because I'm always curious about. Do you know Mike? You know Mike G, right? Because you guys are going to do that interview, right?
You did it yesterday.
How'd it go?
Yeah, great. It's really fun. Yeah,
I absolutely love Mike, and Mike runs a mezcal group out of Austin, and there's all this debate over whether it's appropriate to be making sotol or mezcal in Texas. A couple hundred years ago, the borders were different.
Right.
So if your family's been here this whole time, and you and your family, you've got a tradition to make sotol here in Texas, is it bad when it's what's the word for a denomination of region?
Appellation?
Yeah. So like when you can't call it Scotch if it's not made in Scotland, that sort of thing. But and so there's
I guess there's a historical cultural aspect, and then there's legal
denomination
aspect.
Of origin. That's what it is. Yeah. So just that there's a protection around sotol, and so there's a lot of and I think the first sotol made in the state was by Mike. Mike and his they were distilling sotol before anyone else. So I love Mike. Mike's a great guy. So I'm excited to hear that episode. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, Show to V with Mike G. I've talked about him a bunch on the show. As far as I know, the first spirits related show in the state of Texas was Show to V with Mike G. You can get it on iTunes. And I did an episode when he came to Houston. It hasn't aired yet. I don't know if I wanted to air. We got a little honest.
I was going to say, you guys should do doing each other's,
I wanted to do a swap cast where we film, let's say we film here, and then we air both episodes on each other's shows. But we sat down in a cigar lounge and talked for 2 hours, and we talked about like a side of my family I never talk about. So I don't know who my dad is, sort of thing.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Yeah, so it was kind of like a really honest conversation over Satol. And I was like, yeah, maybe you should just, cut like half the episode. So, but it was I'm a huge Mike G fan, and I wasn't sure if you were doing this show first or his show first. So I'm excited to see that episode.
Sneak preview. So the Radiohead of Compassbox is the Radiohead of whiskey. I think that's
what
what
does
he
that
said.
mean?
Like the
That's a Radiohead. Is this 1994? What? That's a Radiohead was like a.
Yeah, but Radiohead's an evolution.
It's the Pearl Jam of.
You have to listen to Mike's show.
I'll listen to Mike's show. I'm super. I agree. I think that you guys have pushed that boundary, and at times we've talked about the middle finger to the 3-year-old. That whole conversation. I think it's fantastic because I think sometimes when we try to create regulations to protect the consumer, sometimes you inadvertently follow the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law, and end up shooting yourself in the foot. Mm-hmm. Like you can't. You guys have tried to be blatantly transparent on percent. There's literally a breakdown of percentage of what went into what and where it came from, but they won't let you talk about
all the ages. Yeah.
If you it's so absurd that you can't be fully transparent unless you're prompted as kind of like a legal out.
Yeah.
But all right,
I believe that one day the industry will wake up to it. And we'll see the light of day.
Did they ever decide if tequila barrels were allowed? I know that was kind of a controversy.
Yes. The Scotch Whisky Association announced several months ago, that you can now use tequila barrels for Scotch whiskey.
Are we going to use any tequila barrels?
Because it's traditional. Because they were doing that like 350 years ago.
Oh, really? Yeah. Are you guys going to use tequila barrels?
We have no plans at the moment to use tequila barrels.
I don't know that I like the idea of that.
I like tequila.
I like tequila. But I tried, I won't say where, but I tried a recent American whiskey that was finished in tequila barrels, and I wasn't quite sold on it. We did a single barrel with the Rumble. Balcones does a Rumble cask.
Tried that last night.
The Rumble Cask Reserve is one of my favorite things that they make. It's honey and fig whiskey, but not a whiskey. It's a distilled spirit specialty. But they did one in a tequila barrel. It's the oldest thing they've ever released. It's 7 years, spent the entire 7 years in an ex-tequila barrel. And it was so unique and different that it was the first time I actually have enjoyed it. In the past, I didn't care for ex-tequila anything, unless it was just tequila. So, all right, so tell me about this, the blended.
Are we on to
We're on number
Legends 3? Right, so now this one, as you can see, the label gets a little darker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's night.
Dark arts, yeah.
Night for the Minotaur.
Minotaur.
And this is now what we've done is now we're into a blended malt. Now we've left the land of single malt, the category of single malt anyway. And now the third in the Myths and Legends range is a blended malt, meaning it's a combination of 2 or more single malts. In this case, 3. We've taken some of the same parcels of malt whiskey from the Glenelgan distillery that we used for number 2, and we built on that, bringing in smoky whiskeys, peated whiskeys from the the Highland Park distillery and the Talisker distillery.
It's Kalila's on the label.
Kalila, sorry.
Oh, but it does say in Orkney Distillery.
Yeah.
So I assume that's Highland Park. Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry, I get mixed up. So bringing in a smoky component on top of this, and that completely transforms the base whiskey here, the malt whiskey from the Glenelgan distillery, and now you're into something bigger, arguably more complex, and with just a greater, deeper concentration of flavor.
It's that the phenolic aspect is such a small percentage of this, and yet it comes through so strong. I can smell it, taste it.
A little bit of peated whiskey goes a long way. Yeah, in a blend, in a recipe.
So let me ask, on the back, it does mention every distillery except for the Highland Park distillery. It says in Orkney Distillery. Is that a non-disclosure type
that
thing?
was a decision that we made. Some distilleries some distillery owners, I should say, are more sensitive about us using the names than others. No one has ever told us or sent us a formal letter saying, you can't.
Sure.
And we legally, we can identify the source of the distilleries as when we identify them as places. The distinction is if we were to put on the front of the label, this is made with, Macallan,
sure,
or Highland Park, or if we were promoting the fact that it came from that distillery, then arguably we might be accused of trading on their trademark. Yeah, but when you're just using it as on the back label,
description of what went into it and where it came from,
as giving people an indication of where things came from, the places things came from. There's many decades of precedence for this, and we're entitled to do it.
Yeah, sure.
Some of the companies don't like it so much, and so we respect that if they tell us. But very few feel that way or have expressed that to us.
Well, I think there's only two on Me Too, Highland Park and Scapa. Yeah. So
I know, and so what we do in those cases often. And sometimes we choose. We're open. We'll tell people when they ask, but in printed materials, we'll very often just say, "Well, a malt whiskey from the town of Elgin."
Sure.
Right. And so there aren't many malt whiskey distilleries in the town of Elgin,
right.
So people
a distillery
can figure
on
it
Jura
out.
or something.
Yes, it's a distillery. Yeah. Yes.
There's only one. This is absolutely fantastic. Very happy with this. 150 each, available now, nationwide, and it said it's super allocated, so you're only getting a couple.
Yeah, I would try to seek out getting the set.
Sure,
gotta catch them all. But so there's.
Did you just reference Pokemon on the show? Wow, Jack's all excited. Look at him.
Available enough. The U.S. got a pretty sizable allocation of this release, so it shouldn't be too difficult if one is proactive in seeking it out.
Sure. Well, I heard you guys went to Rosewater last night.
We did.
Somebody texted me and said, "Dude."
Alex.
Yeah, he's like, "Dude, John Glaser's here," and I was like, "Yeah, I know he's gonna be on the show tomorrow." He's like, "This is amazing," and so of course those who listen to the show, we're big supporters of Pasha and Rosewater, and they tend to get pretty much everything you guys come out with.
Yeah.
So I was excited to hear that you guys went all the way down there. Are you guys staying in town?
Yeah.
So you drove like an hour south, and
it was not an hour. It was about that late at night. It was about 30 minutes. It wasn't too bad.
Did y'all do just like a pop-up, or was it just like you went to go visit? Or
yeah, we just went to stop by because they're such great supporters of the brand, and they've done things, even the Tobias and the Angel, they did at break-even price, and they have I call it the Compass boxes because they've got shelves of Compass box, and they do really well.
Pasha's great. Okay, so what do you got in your hands
Pasha
here?
is great.
Pasha is great. What do you got in your hands there?
So we're doing something really exciting this week, actually. Tonight in Houston, we're doing to celebrate the first anniversary of Story of the Spaniard. We are doing Spaniard on the Road. So we've brought some of the folks from the Spaniard bar, not restaurant, in New York.
And that's where the name came from, not a specific Spaniard.
Well, the bottle I'm holding is the bespoke whiskey that we created for the Spaniard. And this was actually a predates Story of the Spaniard. It was something that John and Mikey McFerrin and Mark Gibson, the folks that own the Spaniard in New York, they worked on together to create this bespoke whiskey, and it was super popular. And the folks from the Spaniard, just like we share similar ethos, and we just kind of have great synergy and have worked really closely with them. And I would say, I don't know, you can speak better to it than I can, but Story of the Spaniard kind of burst as a little bit of inspiration from this, and in some ways.
Yeah, because we've been thinking for quite a while about adding a sherry cask aged malt whiskey to our malt whiskey core range. And when the guys at Spaniard came forward and said, let's do something like that, I thought, fantastic, we've been thinking about doing this anyway. Put that together, and that really was the springboard for the work that became our permanent our regular item, Story of the Spaniard.
And I think it's a great item because you've got. I was so happy at seeing like a nice $60 price tag on a regularly available item. So if I run out, I know that I can go get it here. Specs has got it. Yeah. Total Wine's got it.
You said you keep it on your bedside. So.
Well, bedside table. I don't sleep with it, but it's definitely our movie. If we're watching a movie, my wife and I have been obsessed with how deep the rabbit hole goes with Stephen King. I didn't realize how much. I knew everyone's heard of Stephen King, and of course we've all heard certain more famous movies than others, but I didn't realize how massively impactful to the zeitgeist of horror and our culture here in America. He's been making films, Stephen King films, since the 70s, and it's so weird to me to know that so my wife and I have been watching a ton of every time we find out, and there's a ton out there. There's literally 50 plus movies, TV shows, miniseries. And so when we're binge watching something, we've been binge watching Castle Rock, which is a phenomenal show on Hulu. The Spaniard has been like our perfect wind down. The kids are in bed, bedside bottle table. So
I'm glad we could help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I don't sound like an alcoholic, I don't know what does.
We're keeping families together since the year 2000.
Speaking of which, you guys have an anniversary coming up.
Yeah, we sure do.
So while you're pouring that, tell me about it.
Well, so next year marks our 20th anniversary as a company. John, you've been making whiskey for 20 years? More, really.
Well, 19 years at the moment. It was since I started Compassbox.
Right. Almost.
And so that's
what's
unbelievable.
coming up? I mean, you guys got, I'm sure there's a 20th anniversary expression.
Yeah, we're working on a couple things that obviously we'll be releasing limited editions every year. It's just part of what we do and who we are. But we got a couple that will make a nod to the 20th anniversary. We're not going to do something that says, hey, it's our 20th anniversary.
Sure.
And that's why you should buy this. But there are a couple things we'll do that'll have a little nod to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's I think you said it earlier, an unctuousness to this particular bottling. I can't quite put my finger on it. Can I see the bottle while I look at it? It's not just the sherry note I get. There's a specific kind of I say yeasty, like a biscuit dinner roll note that I get that I absolutely love.
There's also, it's not just malt whiskeys aged in sherry casks. There are some malt whiskeys finished in French oak, like we do for our spice tree.
Sure.
And there's a little bit of peated whiskey in there as well.
It's like we were going between 3% and 5%, I remember.
Yeah,
and the difference is when you were saying a little peat goes a long way. It was
3 to 5 was huge.
It made a huge difference. But yeah, so if people want to try that one, we're doing the Spaniard on the Road kind of bar takeover in 5 cities over the next month and a half. So this week we're in Houston. Next week, so on the 14th we're in Washington D.C. at Jack Rose.
Sure.
And then the following week we're at Fountainhead in Chicago and Meta in Louisville. And then we're finishing up
1 week at a time. So the next.
So there's going to be 2 the third week of November, the 19th and 20th.
When this airs, those dates will still be available.
Yeah, so. They're just pop-ups, so not ticketed. Just show up. Each pop-up will have a bottle of the Spaniard Bespoke that folks can try, and then a whole bunch of different cocktails featuring story of the Spaniard.
You said you're going to Louisville?
We're going to Louisville.
When?
Yeah, the 20th. November. Are you going to be there?
I'll be there.
No way.
Yeah. So I have to make a pop-up trip. I said pop-up because you said pop-up, but a quick trip over to Louisville on the 19th, the 20th, and we fly home the 21st.
You will absolutely.
So I'm going to come
there.
by and see you guys.
That's going to be fun.
So where is it going to be at in
It's
Louisville?
at Meta.
Meta?
Yeah.
So we have an interview Wednesday morning, the 20th, and then a barrel selection at 1 p.m.
Yeah.
But then after that,
Yes, come by. That
we're
would be
open.
so fun.
So I'll have to come by. And I think, is Will in town? Do you know?
I don't know. He might be. He's like
probably
half
not.
splitting his time in Louisville these days.
That'd be awesome if we can all
But
meet
yeah,
up.
and then we finish up in Miami at the Sylvester. The second week of December we're doing it. December 11th.
How long are you on the road normally?
Oh, he's not gonna.
I'm not.
Hey, I was going to say, well, generally speaking, you don't make, I talked to Eddie Russell with Wild Turkey, and he does like 30 weeks a year where he's on
He
the
has to make
road.
whiskey. He has to go back and make whiskey.
Well, you'd think so does Eddie, but there's a lot of people who are constantly like the face of the brand, so I wouldn't. I've known about you for years. I follow you, but even knowing you were coming on, I was like, "What does his face look like?" Because you don't see a lot of you. You're like this quiet genius that kind of sits in a lab and makes delicious whiskey.
Been making whiskey in a cave for 200 years.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, getting there.
Okay, so let's get deep.
Right.
Ooh.
Is there certain things that you don't care for that you like when you decide you're going to make I'll give you an example. If you don't care for a certain method, like you said, you don't care for chill filtration, you don't care for color, is there a certain type of finish you won't work with? You're not a fan of? Are you completely open to anything like the tequila thing, or is there some things that you just don't ever want to think would be a part of the portfolio?
Well, I don't know if there's anything. I never say never, right? And you really don't ever know until you try things, right? And so, yeah, there's nothing I would rule out just on the face of it, except maybe Malort.
More, yeah.
Seriously, I don't. Yeah, I don't know. Tequila doesn't sound like it makes sense to me. So there's an intuition that suggests, don't
Probably
think so.
not. Yeah.
But you never know. So we did a, yeah. You never know. We filled a Madeira barrique last year for our friends down at Burns in Florida. And I was sure it was going to take 2 or 3 years to integrate with the whiskey for the wood and the Madeira impact and the whiskey to integrate. And I said to them when we did it, it might not taste good. And if it doesn't, we won't bottle it under Compassbox. And if you're okay with that, then fine. And they agreed with that. And I was wrong. After 6 months, it was gorgeous.
Oh, really? Nice.
So you never know, right? You never know. So, and we'd love to replicate that.
On a much bigger scale.
Now I'm thinking differently about Madeira.
Is this the marriage cask that's like ours?
Marion
From
cask?
Burns?
No,
No,
something
this
a
is-
little bit different.
Yeah.
Is it the red bottle with the red wax?
No, it hasn't come out yet.
Oh, okay, hasn't come out yet.
No.
Okay, 'cause we've got friends in Florida
preview.
that when we came out with our Marion cask, we sent them some bottles.
Tampa.
And he correct.
Yeah.
And Chris Breton sent us
Yeah.
some bottles. So it was a fun little venture down the other offerings you have. So anytime I hear Burns is getting something, we're like, hey man, send me a couple bottles.
I would definitely put your
Put my name on it.
Yeah.
Have you thought about doing anything non-whiskey related, non-Scotch whiskey related? Like Barrel Will, they did their vatted malt, which was a bunch of American single malts from all over, which isn't really a real category. We don't have American single malt as a category, but is there something that have you thought about doing something with Armagnac or brandy or?
Well, we just released earlier this year. Yes, is the answer to the question. A blend of Scotch whiskey and Calvados called Affinity, a limited edition, and that was many years. Not so much even in the making. It took us about just over 6 or 9 months, something like that, to actually get the recipe right. But it took years to have the courage to do it.
Sure. Breaks outside your comfort zone?
Well, not so much. It was like, our French importer, La Maison de Whisky, Thierry Benetat, is a good friend, and he's been a great friend of our business for 18 of our 19 years. And so he's French. He's in France, therefore. and that's where Calvados comes from, Normandy.
Sure.
And he was always like, don't do it. But he's the most open-minded guy that
Sure.
I work with. He's got, by far, around
I've had
the world.
some bad Calvados and some fantastic Calvados.
Well, like anything, really. Like
Sure.
anything, good and bad. There are good single malts, there are bad single malts. There are good blends, there are bad. But he was, because in France, sadly, Calvados, well, I think it's one of the great national spirits or great spirits of the world. It's one of the most underappreciated great spirits, I think. It has this reputation of being kind of an old guy's thing in France. But there are forward-thinking producers like Guillaume Drouin that we were introduced to through Terry, I proposed to him, you know what? I've been blending Scotch whiskies and Calvados for years in my kitchen, and I want to bring it to life. Terry says we shouldn't do it, but he introduced me to you anyway, so I think he's okay with it.
Sure.
Will be. And that's so that we put it together. Yeah. This time last year, November, I was at Guillaume's place during the apple harvest, and we were blending Calvados and Scotch whiskies aged in sherry casks, Scotch whiskies aged in French oak casks that give that baking spice character, and we came up with something we love. So the answer is yes.
Yes, in short. Is there a distillery in Scotland that you guys have tried so hard to do something with but have never quite... Is there someone that you want to work with but haven't worked with yet?
There's nobody that we've tried hard but couldn't get them to work with us. I would love one day to work with Springbank, although I've never gone to them and asked.
Springbank is awesome.
So
they don't get enough love here. I see it. So Springbank, I believe, is distributed by Sazerac brands here. They don't give the love and the credit or the attention they need, but those who love Scotch whiskey love Springbank, and for some reason, actually, they may be a Terlato Distell. No. Who's got Springbank?
I don't know.
I forget. Yeah, sorry, I'm talking to myself. But I think that would be great if you can do something with them. They're very well loved.
But back to your question about blending with other spirits, we have tried many things over the years. We've even tried blending Scotch whiskey with mezcal, and
Oof.
Yeah, but nothing's ever really worked. And the Scotch whiskey and Calvados idea, the affinity bottling, it's not a novelty. I mean, we could come out with like a Scotch and American rye blend, and then people would think, oh, that sounds cool, and they might buy some. But I only want to do those things if doing it, blending those things makes something really compelling and something altogether equally, if not more interesting than the individual components.
Sure.
Otherwise, it's just a novelty. So
You don't want to waste anybody's time
or money.
Ooh, jinx joke. You owe me a Coke. So last question, and then we can go. And if you don't answer, you have to drink Malort. Is there a Scotch distillery in which you refuse to work with? No, I'm just kidding. Thanks so much for coming on. It was very nice meeting you, John.
You're welcome.
Kerrin, always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
And cheers, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.
Balcones' first ever year-round bourbon was an inspiration. It all had to work together. A blend of carefully selected ingredients, Texas-sized pot stills, and creative people determined to find the absolute best way to usher a new whiskey along. When you discover how it pairs with a meaningful moment, suddenly the feeling of drinking great whiskey becomes a whole lot more.